The winter of 1142 came down hard on Wickshire, not the kind of winter that makes for pretty tapestries or romantic songs about snow-covered fields. This was the kind of cold that killed people, the kind that turned children's lips blue and made their breathing shallow and then stopped. Lady Hildegard of Wickshire had already buried 2 sons that season. Now she knelt beside her youngest daughter's bed, watching the fever burn through a child who should have had decades ahead of her. The herb stores were nearly empty, a handful of feverfew that should have lasted until spring. Willow bark gone brittle with age, everything Hildegard had learned about healing, everything the women of her family had passed down through generations, and none of it was enough. Not this year, because the real disaster had come the previous summer. The rains fell wrong. They always do in the years people remember. Too much in July when the herbs were flowering, not enough in August when they needed to set seed. Hildegard's medicine garden, the walled sanctuary that had supplied remedies for 120 souls on her estate, produced maybe a third of what they needed. The chamomile grew weak and spindly. The sage developed a fungal rot that spread despite every precaution. Even the hardy rue, which usually thrived regardless of weather, barely reached knee-height. Her daughter died 3 days before Christmas. Hildegard didn't cry. Not yet. There wasn't time for grief when you had an estate to manage and winter had another 3 months to run. But there was time, late at night, to rage. In her private chamber, by candlelight that threw dancing shadows across stone walls, Hildegard pulled out the manuscript. Her late husband had brought it back from the Crusades 5 years earlier, wrapped in oiled cloth and stinking of camel sweat and foreign spices. A Roman text, parts of it barely legible, where some ancient writer named Pliny the Elder rambled about. Everything from astronomy to agriculture. Most of it was useless. Superstitions about planting by moon phases, remedies involving ingredients she'd never heard of. But there was one section, one odd collection of observations about certain plants growing stronger when planted near others. Pliny wrote about it almost casually, as if everyone knew that vines flourished beside elm trees, that garlic helped roses resist disease. He didn't explain why. He just stated it as fact, the way you'd mention that water flows downhill or fire burns wood. Hildegard had read that section a dozen times, dismissed it, because if it were true, wouldn't everyone already know? Wouldn't the Guild of Gardeners, those pompous men who charged estates a fortune for their expertise, wouldn't they be using these techniques, unless they didn't know either? The thought made her sit up straighter, the candle guttered in a draught that found its way through shutters sealed with rags. Outside, the wind carried the sound of someone coughing, deep and wet. More sickness coming. Always more sickness in winter. She needed to try something. When spring finally dragged itself into Wickshire, Hildegard approached old Marie in the garden. Marie had served the estate for 40 years, bent now like the ancient apple trees she tended, fingers gnarled as their roots. But she knew things, the kind of knowledge that didn't come from books or guilds. "My grandmother," Marie said quietly as they worked soil that was barely thawed, she used to plant things, particular ways, said some plants were friends, helped each other grow. Hildegard's hands stilled. "Why did you never mention this?" Marie glanced toward the manor house, then at the nearby fields where workers prepared for planting. "My grandmother whispered it only to me. On her deathbed, said the old ways weren't safe to speak of openly, that the church fathers didn't approve of women claiming to know too much about growing things. They started small. In one corner of the walled garden, Hildegard planted basil seedlings beside her medicinal herbs. The arrangement looked odd, decorative plants mixed with practical ones, but within weeks the difference was visible. The herbs grew fuller, lusher, more insects buzzed around the basil, but fewer attacked the sage and feverfew growing beside it. The basil seemed to confuse them somehow, or repel them entirely. By midsummer, that section of garden was producing twice what Hildegard had harvested in previous years. The discovery sent electricity through her, not the gentle satisfaction of a successful harvest, but something fierce and desperate. Because if this worked for basil and feverfew, what else was possible? She experimented obsessively. Rue planted beside sage created medicine so potent that plague boils, those horrible swellings that killed half the people they afflicted, actually responded to treatment. Chamomile growing near other herbs seemed to protect them from the fungal diseases that had destroyed 60% of herb gardens the previous wet summer. Each combination she tested revealed something new, something that centuries of male experts had somehow missed or forgotten. The estate owed 300 silver marks to the bishop, payment due after harvest. Hildegard had been losing sleep over that debt, wondering if she'd have to sell land that had been in her husband's family for generations. But now, looking at garden beds that overflowed with healthy plants, she began to think differently. This knowledge could save more than her estate. It could transform how all of England grew food and medicine. Sister Catherine noticed first. The nun from the nearby convent stopped by on her regular rounds to collect herbs for the infirmary, and her sharp eyes took in the unusual abundance. "Lady Hildegard," she said carefully, "your garden thrives remarkably this year. God's blessing, surely, but might you share what prayers you've been saying?" The question hung between them, more complicated than it sounded. Hildegard studied the nun's face, seeing intelligence there, and curiosity, and something else. Hope, maybe. The kind of hope that came from tending too many sick people with too few remedies. "Come into my solar," Hildegard said. "I'll show you." Sarah arrived a week later. The Jewish merchant's widow traveled the region, trading in exotic seeds and spices, one of the few women who could move freely because her late husband's connections protected her even now. She stood in Hildegard's garden for a long time without speaking, just observing the way plants were arranged. "This is Moorish technique," she said finally. "From the gardens of Cordoba. I've seen it there, though I never understood the full system. They call it companion planting. The Arabs learned it from the Persians, who learned it from who knows who, perhaps the Romans, before they fell. So it wasn't new, it was old. So old that Europe had forgotten it entirely while other parts of the world preserved the knowledge. That realization felt important somehow. Hildegard began documenting everything, not in obvious ways, because women who claimed too much knowledge about plants ended up accused of consorting with devils. She created a household book, supposedly just prayers and recipes for the kitchen, but she encoded the real information in the margins. Flower illustrations that showed exactly which plants grew together, decorative borders that mapped garden layouts. Anyone who knew how to look would understand. Anyone else would see pretty pictures accompanying pious text. Market day in September changed everything. Hildegard brought her herbs to sell, as she did every autumn. The Reeves' son had fallen ill with the same fever that had killed her daughter and 11 others the previous winter. But Hildegard's herbs, grown in companionship with basil and chamomile, were twice as potent as anything else available. The boy recovered in 3 days. 5 women from neighbouring estates found Hildegard as she was packing her cart to leave. They were desperate. She recognised that desperation because she'd worn it herself 9 months earlier, kneeling beside a dying child. These women had lost children too, had watched the summer's sickness take husbands, servants, parents, had exhausted their herb stores, and their knowledge and their prayers. "Please," said the youngest, a girl barely 20 with shadows under her eyes, "tell us your secret. We'll pay anything, do anything." Hildegard looked at their faces, saw her own grief reflected back, saw the choice she had to make. She could keep this knowledge safe, use it to enrich her own estate, pay off her debts to the bishop and secure her family's future, or she could share it, risk it. Let it spread through networks of women who might or might not understand the danger of knowing too much. "Come to Wickshire," she said quietly. "All of you. Next Sunday after Mass. I'll show you everything." The women left, hope transforming their features. Hildegard watched them go and wondered what she'd just set in motion, whether she'd condemned herself or saved something precious that the world had nearly lost. Old Marie touched her arm. "Your grandmother would be proud," the old woman said. "My grandmother too. Women have always known these things. We just forgot we were allowed to speak them aloud. Winter was coming again, but this time, Hildegard thought, maybe fewer children would die. Knowledge spreads like seeds on the wind. You can't always predict where it will land or what will grow from it. Within 5 years of that September market day, companion planting techniques had spread to 40 estates across 3 counties. Within 10 years, you could find these gardens from Cornwall to Northumberland, and the remarkable thing, the thing that would have baffled any bishop or guildmaster paying attention, was how it spread almost entirely through women. The Sunday gatherings at Wickshire became legendary, though nobody called them that at the time. Young brides arrived supposedly to learn household management from the respected Lady Hildegard. They sat in her solar while she taught them which herbs to grow together, encoding the information in songs they sang while spinning wool. Simple melodies, memorable rhymes. Basil beside the sage will grow, feverfew blooms where chamomile flows. Innocent enough on the surface, devastating in their implications, because what Hildegard was really teaching these women was economic independence. The lying-in chambers became universities of botanical knowledge. When women gathered for births, spending days and sometimes weeks together while waiting for labor to progress, midwives shared more than techniques for delivering babies. They discussed garden layouts, plant combinations, harvest timing. A woman giving birth to her 3rd child might mention casually that her sage grew stronger near the rue. Another would note that marjoram helped prevent blight in neighboring plants. Knowledge accumulated, tested across different soils and climates, refined through hundreds of small experiments. The convents became research centres. Sister Catherine at Wickshire was just the beginning. Nuns at Wilton Abbey, Shaftesbury, Amesbury, they all started experimenting with increasingly sophisticated garden designs. They had advantages that secular women lacked. Time, for one thing. Land, education, the ability to document their findings in convent records that nobody bothered to scrutinize because who cared what nuns wrote about gardens. By 1158, 16 years after Hildegard's first experiments, the results were becoming impossible to ignore. Estates using companion planting produced double the medicinal herbs of traditional gardens, triple in some cases. Their vegetables grew larger, more resistant to disease. Their people survived winters that killed dozens in neighboring villages. And bishops, who collected tithes based on agricultural production, started noticing that certain estates were suddenly very, very profitable. Bishop Henry of Blois was nobody's fool. He'd been appointed to Winchester Cathedral through family connections, sure, but he'd held the position for 23 years because he understood power. How to get it, how to keep it, and most importantly, how to recognize when someone else was accumulating it without his permission. The summons arrived at Wickshire on a cold morning in March. Lady Hildegard was commanded to appear before the bishop to explain the unnatural abundance of her estate's production. The night before her departure, old Marie helped her pack. The old woman moved slowly now, her hands barely able to grip things some mornings, but her mind remained sharp. "They'll accuse you of witchcraft," Marie said bluntly. "The physicians certainly will. They've lost half their wealthy patients to women growing better medicine in gardens." Hildegard had known this day would come. 16 years of watching knowledge spread, watching women gain economic power through plant wisdom. It was inevitable that someone would try to stop it. "Then I'll show them it's not witchcraft," Hildegard said. "It's agriculture." The confrontation in Winchester Cathedral was everything you'd expect from medieval church politics. High ceilings that made voices echo, stone that held the damp cold even in spring, the bishop seated on a throne-like chair, surrounded by clergy whose robes cost more than most peasants earned in a lifetime, and the physicians, oh, they were there. 3 of them, dressed in their academic finest, ready to denounce this uppity woman who dared cure people more effectively than their bleeding and purging. The lead physician spoke first. His name was Master Robert, trained in Paris, and he was furious. "Your Grace, this woman practices dark arts. Her gardens produce herbs of unnatural potency. Patients who should have died from fever recover in days. She disrupts the natural order that God established." The natural order that God established, That's what they always said when they meant the profitable order that we established. Hildegard had prepared for this. She'd brought samples. Basil and sage growing in a single pot, their roots intertwined. Rue and chamomile sharing soil. She explained Pliny's observations, how the Romans had documented these techniques centuries before Christ walked the earth. She described the careful experimentation, the detailed records, the reproducible results. If it's witchcraft, she asked quietly, then why can anyone achieve the same results by planting the same combinations? Why do the nuns at Wilton Abbey grow identical herbs using identical methods? Does God grant witchcraft to holy sisters? That landed hard. You could see it in the physicians' faces. They'd overplayed their hand by calling it witchcraft, because that accusation implicated dozens of convents. Bishop Henry leaned forward. You claim any woman can learn these techniques? Any person, Your Grace. Man or woman. Anyone willing to observe plants carefully and document what works. Then demonstrate, the bishop said. I suffer from chronic stomach ailments. My physicians bleed me weekly. It provides temporary relief. Temporary relief. Hildegard had to suppress a smile. Bleeding provided temporary relief because it made you too weak to notice your stomach hurt. She'd brought her remedy. Rue and sage grown together, dried and prepared as a tea. The bishop drank it while everyone watched. Within an hour, his colour improved. By evening, he was eating a full meal for the first time in weeks. The physicians sputtered protests. Coincidence, temporary improvement. The bleeding had finally taken effect, but the bishop silenced them with a raised hand. Lady Hildegard, he said, you will document these techniques in a proper treatise. You will teach them to any who wish to learn, and you will do so under the Church's protection, because clearly God has granted you insight into His creation. Just like that, everything changed. The knowledge could spread openly, well, more openly. Women still needed to be careful, still needed to couch their expertise in acceptable terms. But the threat of witchcraft accusations receded. Margaret of Wessex transformed companion planting into high art. She created elaborate knot gardens at her estate, geometric patterns of herbs and flowers that looked purely decorative. Nobles competed to commission similar gardens, never realizing they were installing sophisticated companion planting systems. The aesthetic concealed the agricultural. Fashion protected what fear had endangered. The merchant Isabella took the knowledge on the road. She travelled from London to York, carrying seeds and sharing techniques with women at every stop. Her trading network became an information network. A woman in Durham would send word about a new plant combination to Isabella, who'd test it in her own garden, then share the results in Bristol. Knowledge flowed along trade routes faster than any messenger could ride. At Wilton Abbey, Sister Marguerite became almost famous. During the siege of 1173, when armed men blockaded the abbey for 2 months, she fed 300 refugees using gardens that shouldn't have been able to feed 100. Companion planting techniques tripled her yield, growing enough vegetables and herbs to keep everyone alive until the siege ended. After that, nobody dared question whether these gardens were blessed or cursed. Results like that spoke louder than any theological argument. Eleanor of Aquitaine noticed. Of course she did. Eleanor noticed everything that might prove useful. When she returned to her court in Aquitaine, she brought English women skilled in companion planting. French noblewomen suddenly competed to create the most productive herb gardens, though they called it the English fashion and pretended it was about aesthetics rather than agriculture. But not everyone welcomed the change. The Guild of Gardeners had held a monopoly on agricultural expertise for generations. They charged estates enormous fees for advice that often didn't work because, let's be honest, much of their ancient wisdom was nonsense passed down by men who'd never actually gotten their hands dirty. Now estates were bypassing the guild entirely, learning techniques from women who charged nothing or traded knowledge for seeds. The guild masters watched their influence crumble, their income disappear, their authority questioned by women who could demonstrate results. They struck back in 1167. The herb wars started at dawn on a Tuesday in May. Guild members, hired muscle, and angry men who resented women's economic success destroyed 17 companion-planted gardens in a single night. They tore up plants, salted the earth, burned herb stores. At the Thornbury estate, they beat the lady of the house unconscious when she tried to stop them. But they miscalculated. These weren't just gardens. They were food sources, medicine supplies, economic engines. And the women who tended them had sons and brothers and husbands who took violent attacks on their families very seriously. Armed guards appeared in gardens across England. The guild tried to strike again and found themselves facing men with swords who had orders to protect the estate's economic interests. 2 guild members died in a confrontation at Lincoln. After that, the violence stopped. The guild retreated into irrelevance, replaced by a new system where women taught women, and everyone prospered. The secret garden schools started as informal gatherings. Women would meet on feast days, supposedly to prepare for celebrations, actually to share planting techniques. Young girls learned alongside their mothers and grandmothers. The knowledge became embedded in female culture, passed down through generations, protected by networks of women who understood its value. By 1180, you could barely find an estate in England that didn't use companion planting. The technique had spread to France, to parts of Germany, even to Italy, and everywhere it went, it changed how people related to the land, to food, to medicine. Women had preserved and spread a technology that transformed agriculture. They'd done it despite persecution, despite economic opposition, despite men who insisted that women couldn't possibly understand something as complicated as growing plants. They'd done it because winter was coming. Winter was always coming, and children needed to survive. Everything changed in 1215, not suddenly. That's not how these things happen. But if you had to mark the moment when the Church's attitude toward companion planting shifted from acceptance to suspicion, that year would be it. The Fourth Lateran Council met in Rome, and among its many decrees about heresy and proper doctrine, it reinforced restrictions on women claiming religious or medical authority. The Bishop of Winchester who'd protected Hildegard? He'd been dead for decades. The new generation of church leadership looked at economically independent women and saw a threat to proper social order. Agnes of Shrewsbury died screaming, "Let's not sugarcoat this." They burned her alive in the town square on a Thursday morning in 1218. Her crime, officially, was witchcraft. Her actual crime was running a garden that produced medicines more effective than anything the licensed physicians could offer. When the Lord of Shrewsbury's daughter recovered from a fever that had killed 2 of her siblings in previous years, the physicians demanded an explanation. Agnes made the mistake of answering honestly. She described her companion planting techniques, her careful observation of which plants helped others thrive. The physicians heard unnatural knowledge and saw an opportunity to eliminate competition. Agnes's garden was destroyed before they killed her. They made sure of that, salted the earth, burned every plant, seized her household book with its encoded wisdom, and used it as evidence of demonic consultation. The fact that everything in that book was reproducible, testable, based on observation rather than superstition, that didn't matter. What mattered was maintaining control over who could claim expertise, who could cure diseases, who could accumulate wealth through medicine. Women across England understood the message. Keep your head down. Hide what you know. So they did. The encoding became more sophisticated. Embroidery patterns that looked decorative but mapped garden layouts perfectly. A noblewoman might spend years creating a tapestry depicting a garden scene, each plant positioned exactly where it needed to grow for maximum benefit. Visitors would admire the artistry, never realizing they were looking at an agricultural treatise. Children's games preserved the knowledge too. Ring Around the Rosies wasn't about the plague, whatever people say now. But there were counting songs, planting rhymes, games where children arranged flowers in patterns that taught companion planting principles without ever saying that's what they were doing. The knowledge became invisible, embedded in culture so deeply that persecutors couldn't find it to destroy it. The economic transformation continued despite persecution. Actually, because of persecution, because if you couldn't openly share knowledge, you created closed networks, secret systems, and those systems allowed estates using companion planting to accumulate serious wealth without explaining why their production had tripled. The Wickshire estate, now run by Hildegard's granddaughter Emma, exported dried herbs worth 2,000 silver marks annually to London apothecaries. 2,000 marks. That's enough to buy several manors, to outfit a private army, to influence elections for positions in guilds and town councils. Emma didn't flaunt it. She dressed modestly, spoke quietly, and used her wealth to buy protection for other women practicing companion planting techniques. This wealth threatened traditional power structures in ways that simple agricultural innovation never could. A woman who controlled significant economic resources didn't need to marry for security, could choose her own alliances, could fund her own projects. The system where women transferred from father's control to husband's control worked only if women couldn't support themselves. Companion planting broke that system. A Venetian merchant offered Emma 3,000 marks for the complete companion planting system. "Just write it down," he said. "All of it. Every technique Hildegard discovered and her descendants refined. We'll print it," he promised. "Spread it across Europe. Make you rich beyond imagination." Emma refused, because she understood that knowledge written down could be stolen, suppressed, controlled. Knowledge embedded in networks of women, encoded in art and song and children's games, that survived. But she did create the Codex Hortensis. It took 5 years. Emma worked with Sister Anne at Wilton Abbey, a brilliant illuminator whose botanical illustrations were so precise they looked like the plants might grow right off the page. The Codex appeared to be a book of hours, prayers for different seasons. But the margin illustrations, the decorated capitals, the seemingly ornamental borders, they encoded every companion planting technique developed over 7 decades of experimentation. Which plants grew together, which combinations enhanced medicinal properties, how to arrange gardens for maximum yield. The Codex looked religious. It was agricultural revolution disguised as devotion. 3 copies were made. 1 went to a convent in France, 1 to a monastery in Germany. 1 remained, at Wickshire, hidden in a wall cavity that wouldn't be discovered for 400 years. The knowledge was too valuable to exist in only one place, too dangerous to exist openly. Then came 1348. The Black Death arrived in England that summer, and it was worse than anything people had imagined. Worse than the stories from the continent. In villages without companion-planted gardens, without the enhanced medicines these gardens produced, mortality rates hit 60%. Entire communities vanished. Lords died alongside peasants because the plague didn't care about social rank. But in villages where women had secretly maintained companion planting knowledge, where gardens produced potent medicinal herbs, mortality rates dropped to 30%. Still horrific, still devastating. But 30% versus 60% meant the difference between communities that survived and communities that ceased to exist. This pattern was too obvious to ignore. Church officials noticed, local lords noticed. The few surviving physicians definitely noticed, and their response was complicated. Some saw divine providence, God protecting those who understood his creation more deeply. Others saw suspicious patterns. Why did estates run by knowledgeable women survive better than those run by men following traditional practices? Surely that indicated something unnatural. The women who survived became even more protective of their knowledge. They'd watched too many friends die to risk the information being suppressed again. The initiation ceremonies became elaborate. A woman teaching her daughter companion planting techniques would create multiple false trails, encoding fake information in obvious places to mislead anyone trying to steal the real secrets. The genuine knowledge got passed down only to women who'd proven themselves trustworthy through years of apprenticeship. Brother Thomas, at a Franciscan monastery in Kent, was one of the few men who understood what was happening. He'd grown up watching his mother tend a remarkable garden, had learned her techniques before taking vows. When he became the monastery's record keeper, he began secretly documenting companion planting methods in Latin, hiding them in agricultural treatises that looked like translations of Roman texts. His records preserved techniques that would have been lost when the women who knew them died without daughters to teach. The Renaissance arrived, eventually, as it does, and male scholars rediscovered companion planting. Pietro de Crescenzi published his agricultural treatise in 1305, presenting companion planting as new scientific observation. He never mentioned medieval women, never acknowledged that he'd learned these techniques from his mother's garden, that she'd learned from her mother, that the knowledge chain stretched back 200 years to Lady Hildegard experimenting in Wickshire while grieving her dead children. The scholars genuinely seemed to believe they'd discovered something new. They documented it, tested it, published learned papers about which plants grew well together. They created systematic classifications and theoretical frameworks. They made it respectable, academic, male, and they had no idea they were just writing down what generations of women had been doing quietly in gardens across Europe, preserving knowledge through centuries when claiming to know too much could get you killed. The irony would be funny if it weren't so tragic. Women saved the knowledge that fed Europe through plagues and famines. Men took credit for discovering it. But the knowledge survived. That's what matters. Hidden in tapestries and songs, preserved in secret books and monastery records, taught mother to daughter in whispers and winks. It survived because women understood that some things are too important to let die. Winter was always coming. Children always needed to survive. And companion planting knowledge, purchased with grief and experimentation, and sometimes with lives, that knowledge kept blooming in gardens from Wickshire to Venice, from convents to cottages, wherever women looked at plants and saw not just food but possibility. Mary Brewster carried a secret in her luggage when she boarded the Mayflower in 1620. Hidden in a hollowed-out Bible cover, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a manuscript page. Just one page, carefully torn from a larger book and smuggled across the Atlantic. Her grandmother had pressed it into her hands the night before departure, whispering that she'd need it in the new world. The page contained companion planting instructions encoded in what looked like prayers and recipes: basil beside tomatoes, beans climbing cornstalks, marigolds protecting everything. Plymouth Colony nearly starved that first winter. You know the story. Half the colonists dead, the rest surviving only with help from the Wampanoag people, who taught them how to grow corn using techniques they'd developed over thousands of years. The Three Sisters planting method: corn, beans, and squash, grown together in mutually supporting arrangements. Mary Brewster looked at those gardens and felt recognition shock through her. This was companion planting. The same principles her grandmother learned from manuscripts tracing back to medieval England, emerging independently in indigenous American agriculture. Different plants, same wisdom: corn providing structure for beans to climb. Beans fixing nitrogen in soil that fed the corn. Squash spreading shade that suppressed weeds and retained moisture. Two cultures, separated by an ocean and thousands of years of development, discovering identical agricultural truths through careful observation. The fusion happened naturally. English colonists who knew companion planting techniques from European traditions met Native Americans who'd perfected similar methods. They shared knowledge, tested combinations, created hybrid systems that worked better than either tradition alone. Tomatoes from the Americas growing beside, basil from Europe. Native squash protecting European herbs from insects, agricultural wisdom flowing both directions across the cultural divide. Then, enslaved Africans arrived, and they recognized these techniques too. West African agriculture had developed companion planting independently, yams growing beside cassava, certain herbs protecting food crops from pests. The enslaved people forced onto American plantations looked at colonial gardens and saw familiar patterns. They added their own knowledge, creating fusion systems that combined 3 continents' worth of agricultural wisdom: European herbs, Native American vegetables, African planting rhythms, all growing together in gardens that fed plantation communities despite brutal conditions. This knowledge survived in cottage gardens and slave gardens, in places where people couldn't afford to fail at growing food. While wealthy landowners experimented with monoculture cash crops, poor people maintained diverse gardens using companion planting because their lives depended on it. The Industrial Revolution nearly killed everything. Factory farming emerged in the 19th century, driven by the same logic that built assembly lines and coal-powered mills. Efficiency meant specialization. Plant one crop across huge fields, use mechanical harvesters designed for single crops, rely on distance transportation to move food from specialized growing regions. The diversity that companion planting required looked inefficient by industrial standards, but the knowledge survived in allotments and cottage gardens. Working-class women maintained the old ways because they worked. A factory worker's wife growing vegetables in a tiny urban garden couldn't afford expensive inputs or failed harvests. She planted marigolds beside tomatoes because it meant her family ate better. She trained beans up corn stalks because vertical growth mattered when you had 20 square feet of soil. She preserved techniques that wealthy farmers abandoned. Elizabeth Blackwell created the first scientific herbal in 1737, documenting which plants grew well together and why. Her illustrations were precise, her observations detailed. The book became a standard reference for physicians and botanists. Nobody mentioned that Elizabeth learned much of this knowledge from her washerwoman, a woman whose grandmother had learned it from her grandmother in an unbroken chain stretching back to medieval herb gardens. The pattern repeated throughout history. Working-class women preserved knowledge. Middle-class women documented it. Male scholars published it and took credit. The cycle was so consistent it was almost funny. Almost. 2 world wars changed everything again. Victory gardens became patriotic duty. Governments encouraged citizens to grow their own food to support the war effort. Suddenly, companion planting techniques that had been dismissed as old-fashioned folk practice became strategic resources. Gardens using these methods produced 40% more food in the same space compared to traditional single-crop plots. That difference mattered when ships full of food were being sunk by submarines. Millions of people learned companion planting during those war years, learned that marigolds protected tomatoes from aphids, that beans enriched soil for other plants. That careful arrangement of different species created more productive gardens than monoculture ever could. The knowledge spread farther in 4 years of war than it had in the previous century of peace. Then the 1960s organic movement rediscovered everything Lady Hildegard had documented 800 years earlier. Rachel Carson's research into pesticides and ecosystem health led her to study traditional farming practices. She documented how companion planting reduced pest problems naturally, eliminating the need for toxic chemicals. She proved scientifically what medieval gardeners had known through observation, that diverse plantings were more resilient than monocultures, that plants really did help each other grow, that the old wisdom was wisdom after all. Cornell University conducted studies in 1973 proving that basil planted beside tomatoes increased yield by 37% while reducing aphid populations by 68%. Exactly what medieval women had claimed. Exactly what male physicians had dismissed as impossible folk magic. Bill Mollison studied medieval monastery gardens while developing his permaculture theories in 1978. He documented companion planting arrangements in ruins of old abbey gardens, mapped the sophisticated agricultural systems nuns had created, traced the knowledge back through centuries of careful cultivation. His sustainable agriculture movement essentially reconstructed medieval women's techniques using modern ecological terminology. The irony was profound. Modern scientists using cutting-edge technology to prove that medieval women had understood plant biology better than anyone gave them credit for, using controlled studies and statistical analysis to validate knowledge that had been dismissed as superstition because women knew it. Today, urban gardens from Manhattan to Tokyo use companion planting. Vertical farms employ LED lights calibrated to replicate the spectral patterns that make basil protect tomatoes most effectively. The specific wavelengths of light, the chemical signals plants exchange, we understand the mechanisms now. But the practice? That's unchanged from what Hildegard discovered by candlelight in 1142, watching basil repel insects from neighboring sage. The regenerative agriculture movement recognizes that medieval women understood soil health, beneficial insects, plant communication, ecosystem thinking, all of it, centuries before modern science developed vocabularies to describe these concepts. The new agriculture is actually very old, preserved by women who couldn't publish papers or claim expertise, but could observe carefully and remember accurately and teach their daughters. There's a garden in Manhattan now, on a rooftop in the Bronx, where teenage girls grow tomatoes beside basil, beans beside corn, marigolds protecting everything. They think they're learning new techniques, life hacks for urban farming. They don't know they're part of a tradition stretching back almost 1,000 years. Don't know that women who look like their grandmothers preserved this knowledge through persecution and dismissal and centuries of being told that women couldn't understand agriculture. The seeds Hildegard planted that first desperate spring didn't just grow into herbs that saved her estate. They grew into a knowledge system that spanned continents and centuries, that survived plagues and wars and industrial agriculture, that transformed how humans relate to the land. Her name is mostly lost now. History didn't record many details about a medieval widow experimenting in her garden. The church records mention Lady Hildegard of Wickshire briefly, note that she paid her debts to the bishop, list her death in 1167. That's all. No monument, no recognition of what she started. But her wisdom blooms everywhere, in every companion-planted garden from ancient Wickshire to modern Manhattan, in every teenager who plants basil beside tomatoes and marvels at how well they grow together, in every farmer who uses diverse planting to reduce pesticide use, in every community garden that feeds neighbors using techniques preserved by women who understood that knowledge too important to let die. Winter is always coming. It came for Hildegard's children in 1142. It comes for all of us, eventually. But the knowledge survives. The gardens keep growing, and somewhere, in ways we can't fully trace, that desperate, woman's winter experiments still feed the world. The seeds she planted grew into forests we're still exploring, and they'll keep growing long after we're gone, because that's what seeds do when they're planted by women who understand that some things matter more than credit or recognition. Some things matter because they keep children alive through winter. That's where this story ends. And where it continues, because right now, somewhere, someone is planting basil beside sage, teaching a daughter or grandson, preserving knowledge that stretches back centuries. The chain remains unbroken. The gardens keep blooming. Winter is coming. But we know how to survive it now, thanks to women whose names we never learned.